remember we finished on alienation, we didn't completely finish it. So capitalism and freedom. The consolidation of our product over us, out of our control, is what happens under capitalism. We lose control over the product, over the process, and of course, therefore, we lose freedom. Because remember, freedom, just like Hegel was saying, is self-determination, is when you are controlling yourself and not somebody else controls you. Even though both Marx and Hegel think that just lack of somebody controlling you is not enough. That is negative freedom. But nonetheless, in order to have positive freedom, in order to be able to choose what is the best, most rational solution, you still need to have freedom from others controlling you. Human freedom requires not only that people should not be, as Locke was saying, subject to arbitrary will of others, it also requires that the social relations in which they stand should be product of their own will. If the people do not select the system under which they live and the way they live under the system, then that is not a true freedom. It is illusion of freedom. Under capitalism, people are fooled into thinking that the social conditions are given, when in fact they are chosen by those in power to preserve their domination. What's the solution? Well, Marx doesn't think just giving workers more money or better distribution of money is the solution. He actually thinks, that's the quote, that increasing the wages would be nothing but better payment for the slave and would not conquer either for the worker or for labor their human status and dignity. So, in other words, even better paid workers in the capitalist world are still slaves, and they are still not free. They are just better paid slaves. They are slaves which are treated nicer. The source of alienation in this case is important to understand. And we can, for one thing, remember this relation of master and servant, which we saw in Hegel. Like I said, it actually impressed Marx greatly. He read it as a young man, and that explained to him a lot about human relations in general and the relations of domination, which happen under capitalist society all the time, because this is a very competitive society. Even though you don't necessarily put up your life, as it was in this example, but you still end up in some sort of struggle with other people, and they do eventually manage to get control over you. And that happens historically, so people who were in control a few hundred years ago typically keep this control, and so it's very hard to overturn this. Private property would be part of it. According to Marx, private property is actually the result of these relations, not the cause of them, because when you have this relation of domination, private property protects people who have a lot of property from others taking some of it. And the most important thing he was calling for is emancipation of the worker, which according to Marx would be also emancipation of the entire humanity. It's necessary nothing less than a radical reorganization of the structure of power and economics. Do you think the problem of alienation can be solved? What do you guys think about that? Now, I think what I mentioned last time is, interestingly enough, according to this early analysis, the countries in Europe who were considered socialist are not socialist. Why? Did they have division of labor? Did you have factories in like Soviet Union and other countries in Europe? Yeah. Well, that is alienation. The workers did not have the product of their labor. They did not have any control over the process. Funny enough, when the revolution just happened in 1917 in Russia, there were, of course, ideas to give workers control. But, and we will talk about it later today, that didn't work very well, for a simple reason that the production itself does not allow for this type of self-control on behalf of the workers. The workers started voting to reduce their work day, to increase their own pay, And then that became so ridiculous that those factories could not function anymore. As a result, Bolshevik government started appointing managers who would have the power to fire workers and who would take control of the production, and then effectively they became the same as in capitalist society. They were controlling the worker in a similar way, determining the wages based on productivity. Workers were driven to produce more for less pay, and that became even more restrictive because, at least in the capitalism, you have some sort of freedom. And the socialist system, one of the other things which is funny enough they introduced is zero unemployment, right? You would think it's a great thing. Everybody gets a job. Isn't it fantastic? Here's how it worked, though. If you don't get a job, you're a criminal because everybody is required to work and you are violating the law. So you go to jail and then you work in jail. Except, of course, as a prisoner, and they're not even paying you. If you want to avoid it, you are required to take any job, not the job you like, but any job. You literally get a warning from the government that within 3 months you must find work. So if you can't find work as an engineer, well, work as a janitor. Otherwise, you go to jail. And that's how they achieved 100% unemployment. There were still people who were able to somehow weasel their way around the system. Like when I grew up, for example, it was very popular for young people to get jobs like night guard at the factory site or something, where you literally don't do anything, just sit there and get paid very, very small amount of money, but officially you are employed. So that was one way to avoid being prosecuted, because that was persecution. On the other hand, if you got a job, it was difficult to fire people. But if somebody did get fired, again, they would be officially breaking the law. And you also can't quit for the same reason. It was very difficult to quit those jobs. So yeah, that did not solve the problem of alienation at all. In fact, it came back with a vengeance. Now, there is actually an explanation in Marx why it was happening. Funny enough, not everybody understood it. Historical materialism. What exactly is historical materialism? A name frequently given to Marx's philosophy. He himself didn't call it that. Philosophy of history and theory of economics based on materialistic conception of reality and causation. Now, what exactly is it? First of all, he does take a lot from Hegel, but he says Hegel is standing on his head. He uses dialectic, he uses historicism, the idea that society does develop through history, right? Except he doesn't think the ideas is what is driving society. He actually completely rejects that. He thinks that Hegel was looking at it upside down. Hegel thought that everything is an idea. On the contrary, Marx thinks that this is not how society works. Here's the good quote from Marx. The mystification which dialectic suffers in Hegel's hands by no means prevents him from being the first to present its general form of working in a comprehensive and conscious manner. With him, it is standing on its head. It must be turned right side up again if you would discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell. So what he means is, it does indeed work this way, but it's not the ideas which are driving people. It's the material conditions. The material conditions are primary. Ideas are secondary. He has economic interpretation of history. He says the ideas play at best subsidiary role. People cannot eat ideas. People must live in material world and use material objects to satisfy their need. So economic conditions are the base on which human history is built. There are three elements to historical materialism: forces, powers of production, relations of production, and so-called superstructure. So forces of production is the foundational part. It's like the brick on which everything, forces of production. That is, first of all, means of production, natural resources, tools, machines, right? And human labor, because the machines and natural resources by themselves can't turn themselves into factories or anything. Then there are relations of production which actually stem from that. So if you look at the factory, for example, management of the factory, specific roles of specific workers, all these relations of production is derivative of the forces of production. If you have a factory, this is how you have to set it up. You're not going to set it up in any other way. If you do, it's not going to be productive. It's going to fall apart. That's exactly the explanation why it didn't work in Russia in 1917. And there are several other things to say about it, which I can say in a few minutes. And then what he calls superstructure is on top of that. It's derivative of these two, right? So this is primary, this is secondary, and this is kind of a third level. What exactly is superstructure? Legal and political system as well as forms of social consciousness. This is what kind of laws we have, and what we think about ourselves as society. It's derivative from these two. So this is the kind of a picture nicer than what I have on the board, but I still wanted to put it on the board too. Forces of production on the bottom as the most foundational, relations of production which derived from this, and this whole thing is an economic substructure. Superstructure, which includes the art, religion, and philosophy, remember the ones Hegel was talking about, as well as legal and political system. This is all superstructure, and it's like this foam which kind of basically appears on the surface of everything else. That's how Marx thinks about it. And two more useful terms here, economic and technological determinism. So economic determinism does tell us that the economic structure of society determines its legal, political, and cultural forms. Superstructure kind of rises or corresponds from that. And technological determinism tells us that changes in the technology, forces of production, produce changes in the organization of society, not the other way around. Hence, at the lower level, the relations of production correspond to the stage of development of the forces of production. Now, whether Marx actually agreed that there is economic and technological determinism is a big question, because it creates immediately a paradox which many people noticed. If that is indeed the fact, then how can you possibly call for society to change? It actually suggests that society changes when it's ready to change. And that is more or less how he describes it. So basically, well, a couple of words about ideology. So this part of this superstructure is the ideology. The word ideology is actually, I think, originated with Marx. At least he is the first one who talked about it in this way, in German ideology. So superstructure represents all the ways in which people in a particular age tend to think of themselves and their activities. However, the way in which people think and speak of themselves is not always consistent with what they are and what they do. We may think of this ourselves one way, but we really are, it really is different from that. And the word, we mentioned it in psychology, the word is rationalization. Remember, like I gave you this example, that when my eyesight started going worse, I started to convince myself that I actually don't like physical books and reading more electronic books. I was, in a sense, lying to myself, because I had to adapt to the situation. But once I discovered that you can have glasses and that solves the problem, I immediately realized that I was lying to myself. Prior to that, I didn't know that. I wasn't consciously lying to myself, right? Same thing happens on the level of society. The society could be lying to itself in the same way and engaged in rationalization. Rationalize the behavior of society in order to maintain and justify the current social system. And that is what Marx called false consciousness. And he referred to it as ideology. Ideology, according to Marx, is this false consciousness of society, which society has. Partly, indeed, it could be, not deliberate. But there may also be some deliberate element in it, because there's always people who benefit from a specific structure of society, and those people are interested in maintaining this structure. They don't want it to change. Like in medieval days, all the lords and aristocracy were like this. So Marx actually does talk about the French Revolution, the English Revolution, and how that happened because of changing forces of production. The factories actually started to appear at that time. And factory and machine production was incompatible with the superstructure of society as they had it, incompatible with this aristocracy holding positions of power. There were new people emerging, the bourgeois, the people who themselves were not of noble blood, but had a lot of money because they owned a lot of these newly built factories. And because of that, the struggle appeared, and of course, as a result of the struggle, revolution happened. And that's another thing here. So ideologies are cultural expressions which represent society's self-understanding, but can often represent a distorted view of reality, ideological illusion, and thereby to serve to maintain and justify the power structure. And he looks at it famously, the whole process as the class struggle. He thinks about different classes of society, some classes more dominant, some classes less. So according to Marx, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guild master and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. So that's, according to Marx, is what drives history. Not the ideas, but the material development. He famously made this distinction of bourgeoisie and proletariat. First of all, bourgeoisie, that's actually kind of from French. Bourgeois is somebody who lives in a city, not necessarily the way Marx thought about it. And proletariat are the workers who own no property. They must survive by selling their labor as commodity. And this is the two classes which, according to Marx, are struggling against each other in a capitalist society, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Bourgeoisie is interested in preserving this structure of society. They were, in turn, oppressed by the aristocracy for many centuries when they first started to emerge with the Industrial Revolution. But eventually they did overtake and they became dominant around 19th century. But proletariat is emerging as a result of that, as a result of capitalism. So bourgeoisie originally just meant townsmen, referred to the new class of merchants, moneylenders, and masters of the craft guilds that arose at the end of the Middle Ages. Proletarian just comes from a Latin word which means propertyless. Now, the ideology, according to Marx, is a product of a dominant class. This is another quote. The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. The class which has the means of material production at its disposal has control at the same time over the means of mental production. So whoever controls this, controls this. Forces of production, relations of production, that is what determines ideology. And intellectuals, according to Marx, the people who are here just serving those in power. He says all intellectuals in society are active, conceptive ideologists who make the perfecting of the illusions of the class about itself their chief source of livelihood. They may delude themselves that they actually are free thinkers, but in reality they are just serving the dominant class. If dominant class is the bourgeoisie, then they are serving the interests of the bourgeoisie. Ideologists present this inverted upside-down perspective because they distort reality and reverse the true direction of causality. In all ideology, human beings and their circumstances appear upside down. So what is he talking about? This is how people usually think about it. This is how philosophers thought about it, right? We have a certain historical stage when we have a particular philosophy. And the society is a kind of derivative of that. Then intellectual revolution happens. People change their ideas about society, which is the way Hegel thought about it. And then different philosophy emerges, and society in turn changes because of that. However, that is the traditional view. Marx thinks that actually is not what is really happening. It happens in the following way. In the historical stage, one, whatever it is, there is an economic system, A, of particular type. And the philosophy society has at the time is derivative of that. Now, once economic system changes, that changes the philosophy, not the other way around. So economic system, the base, is more fundamental, and this is what determines which ideas are permanent and how does society function, because all the rest of it is nothing but derivative. The way it happens with ideas is there's like a natural selection of ideas. The ideas will only flourish, be encouraged, and get a hearing if they correspond to the prevailing economic system. Otherwise, they'll be blocked out or selected. How it happens in society? Well, we can look at it like this way. Right now, what is the one way people exchange ideas? The most popular way. Exactly. Okay, on social media, you know that there are some, what do they call? Bloggers, influencers, right? They're the most popular bloggers. They have millions of views. Now, do they make money? Some of them? Like, you know anybody who has more than 1 million followers and not making any money? Just doing it for the fun of it? I don't. Maybe there is somebody, but I have never heard of that. Unless it is like a politician or somebody who already does something else, right? And they kind of blog in on the side. But then that's not an influencer. In that case, it's not their main source of, not their main occupation. But if it is their main occupation, at the great majority they are making money. How do they make money? Sponsorships, exactly. You can even make a little bit of money if you just have a lot of followers per view, but that's not a good money. Anybody who does that can tell you, you need to have deals. You need to have deal with a company, and then what did the company actually tell them? You have to advertise their product in some way. Your videos have to be tailored around it. So you, of course, if you're very skillful, you can do it very skillfully. Like you can say, hey, I'm wearing such a comfortable shoes today. Yeah, you know, you can actually buy them. And there's a link right there. So basically, that's the idea. And of course, the whole thing, again, everything else they say and they think even is related to that in some way, because they still want to be popular, they still want people to listen to them and to buy this stuff. And if they don't, then what can happen? They can get cancelled, right? Somebody will stop giving them promotions, people will stop watching them, they'll lose a lot of money. And that is how ideas are selected even today. And that was always the case. In Marx's time, you couldn't have your own internet blog, but you could still get published in a magazine or get a position of a professor or something. But if, especially those in power, those people who at the time held power, do not like what you're saying, you would not be able to do it. They'll block you out. So internet gives a little bit more flexibility because indeed now you can say almost anything you want, and it's pretty hard for the government to control you. They're trying. You have to give them credit. They are trying their best, but it's just harder because it's very easy to create your page and have millions of viewers compared to the 19th century when if you wanted to open your own paper, you needed a lot of money and equipment, and you needed to even hire people so they would work the presses. And today you don't need any of it. So it's easier today, but the idea is still similar and it still is there. People can be blocked out or selected if their views are not corresponding to this ideology prevalent in the society. And then his theory of revolution. That is, of course, probably the most controversial part. He thinks that during the relatively stable times in any historical era, everything works fine. Social order corresponds to the technology, and there is no problem. But here's the thing which happens every once in a while. Forces of production change. As a result of general progress of society, like machines were invented at some point, and that created different base. You have then different forces of production, right? These forces of production, in turn, require different relations of production. It's not always, and in fact it is fairly rare, that the superstructure, the ideas, change so quickly. They kind of fall behind because the ideological structure is usually more entrenched. And that is when revolution might happen. Here's another quote. At a certain stage of their development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or but a legal expression of the same thing, with the property relations within which they have been at work hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, this relation turn into their fetters. Then begins the epoch of social revolution. So the whole structure needs to change. It doesn't change. Who is typically holding it? Which group of people is known to hold on to the way things were before? What do we call them? Conservatives, exactly. That's what they want to conserve everything, to keep it the way it was before. And of course, there's always some progressive forces who are fighting against it. So that would be what is happening in society when it is time to change, but some people don't want to change. And it always leads to conflict. The conflict increases, and according to Marx, it is pretty much always leads to a revolution. Whether revolution in this situation is inevitable or not, open to interpretation, Marx thought it is inevitable. So this is the historical epochs according to Marx. First, there was epoch of primitive communal economic system, the tribal system. That would be like prehistoric times, early historic. Then there was a slave system. It had an ancient communal and state property ownership. Slave system didn't just emerge because people suddenly decided that they want to enslave one another. It emerged because under their technology at the time, it was the most effective way for society to function. There was a lot of agriculture, a lot of jobs which people otherwise wouldn't do. They needed to enslave somebody to do it. Then feudal system, estate ownership. Now, feudal system was already different because there was more developed material base which no longer required the type of slave relations. In fact, many people say that even in this country, the biggest reason why civil war happened and why this entire the idea that slavery should be abolished emerged is because industrial base in the north developed towards capitalist system, whereas in the south they still had more agricultural type of production, right? So that came into conflict because for the north, slave system was no longer acceptable for economic reasons. But since it was no longer acceptable for economic reasons, there was a demand to change it. The South resisted it. Civil war happened. And this typically is the case. The progress won. Progress always wins. There's no way to preserve things the way they were before. And then there is a capitalist system, which is, by the way, if you think Marx is just an enemy of capitalist system and he always says it's horrible, no. He says for what it was after feudal system, it was a progressive system. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it when it was time for it. But he thinks it's not the end of the story. He thinks that the socialist and the communist system is inevitably going to happen. It is the next stage. Why is he thinking that? Well, let's take a look at his argument. Well, first of all, he criticizes capitalism. He analyzes it. He says that the labor theory of value, which Locke and Ricardo held, and labor theory of value tells us that everything has value to the degree that you put any labor into it, right? So, for example, what is the value of a table? Well, when it was growing as a tree in a forest, it had no value. But once you put some sort of work into it, you maybe spend 5 hours of your time creating that table, that value is the value of your labor, whatever you put into it. The more labor you put into something, the more value it has. And according to Locke and Ricardo, that labor actually is yours, so the value is yours. Worker labor is a commodity, and according to the system, we can sell it. So when we sell the table, or when we work for wages, we're selling our labor. Now, what Marx actually says is when bourgeois hire workers, and instead of like worker producing something and selling it themselves, they are paid wages, what happens is certain expropriation. The worker only works part of the time for themselves. But part of the time what they are producing, the owner of the factory, the owner of the means of production expropriates. And that's the way they get enriched, right? So you can think about it this way. Let's say if you are working all day and you pay $200, well, certainly what you produce must be worth more than $200. Because otherwise, they're not going to hire you. It would be stupid for them to hire you and pay you everything you earned. So what you really produce, you may think $220, and those $20 is what the owner of the factory, owner of the means of production takes away, the profit, right? So Marx thought about it in terms of work time. Whether it's the best way to think about it, well, now economists obviously don't like thinking about it in this way, because in terms of time, obviously, it's hard to say how productive is your work. It may then seem like if you work longer, you are earning more, when in fact you could just be less skillful or lazy, and that makes it lengthier and more. But if you think about it in terms of money only, you can also see that something like this does happen, because certainly people wouldn't be building this multi-billion personal fortunes if they didn't somehow expropriate something from other people. And that's his idea. In Capital, he actually is trying to prove it. He dedicated the entire work to methodically, in his German, very methodical way, prove to people that they are in fact being exploited. Did he do it successfully? Well, there are different opinions about it, but most economists think he didn't. And it's not because it's not happening, but because it's very difficult to prove it. It's one thing to kind of have an idea that it must be happening. It's another thing to actually prove it, because there are so many elements to this whole thing. Obviously, in traditional economic, the mainstream economic, what they would tell you is that people who own this means of production, first of all, risk their own capital, they invest their time, they have to organize the whole thing, or at least hire people to organize it correctly, and so on. So you cannot dismiss it either. How much money does it really worth? It's hard to say, because it's not the same thing as simple product, right? How valuable is what CEO is doing? How much CEO deserves as a compensation? It's not an exact math. You cannot be calculating it the way Marx was doing it. So that part is a little bit flimsy there. Nonetheless, he makes a point why the system should change, and he uses the Hegelian dialectic. First, he says, well, we look at it again as thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Thesis would be the capitalist system itself. And he says the capitalist system itself, just like Hegel's ideas, has certain fractures within it. One of these contradictions involved in the system is that a small class of people owns and controls the major forces of production as their private property and employs workers who have no economic resources but their own labor. But the ideology is based on individualism, yet it creates this organized workforce, right? Workers can and do frequently organize and work together because they feel like they have common interests. That's why there are strikes happening and so on, right? So that's already a one contradiction. In the competitive struggle for profits, machinery is introduced. Machinery, unlike people, cannot be exploited. So the source of surplus value is cut off. That's an interesting idea, because we do kind of see what is happening in this country right now is that we do indeed develop more and more ways to produce without people, right, with machines. But then once it started happening, what other things started happening with the economy? What happens to production? Where is the production now? Where are all the factories? You guys should know. Yeah.
You're like overseas in China? Or
yeah, that's where they went. China, Vietnam, countries with cheaper labor, because they no longer able, we have relatively strong laws, and working people can organize and demand higher wages and so on. You really, there's only so low a wage you can pay, so they no longer are capable of paying these super low wages here. They pay them there. They go there, they build a factory. These people there work for very low wages. Like I think Chinese workers make about, what, $500 a month? Something which they couldn't possibly do here. And they kind of extract their labor, and then they bring product here and sell it here. Now, it's also interesting that they recognize that there is a problem with that to begin with, because we become dependent on them, right? Like this master-servant relations. Once you conquer somebody, you become dependent on them. So during the pandemic, it became very obvious that almost everything is produced in China and Vietnam. What if they cut communications? Now they are talking about possibility of war with China or something. How are we going to then live? Even things like, it's not just tables and furniture. Microchips. Microchips, majority of them are made in Taiwan. And Taiwan, even though it's an independent part of China, but it is part of China. And China actually wants to kind of bring them back under their wing. And people realized that this could have huge problems, so they started talking about doing what? Bringing it back here. In fact, Trump is the huge proponent of bringing, but there is a problem, right? Cost of labor, it's extremely high. How do you resolve this problem? Well, one partial solution seems to be now, and that actually is what they're talking about. The factories which are coming back here have almost no workers. They are trying to replace them, if not 100%, then 99% with robots. They tried it, it's difficult. The robots are still not as sophisticated because for certain types of production, Nike's tried to build factories and they discovered that the robots just cannot do it. It's too complicated for the robot to do this part of work which workers typically do. But there's really no way around it because otherwise you have to pay workers a lot more, and that raises the cost of production, and that raises the cost of the product, and then you can't sell this product. Would you buy Nikes for $500? Probably not. So what are they going to do? They can't sell them below cost because then they're going to go bankrupt. But Marx was kind of looking at that already, and that's 200 years ago, but he was thinking that that will be happening. There will be more and more machines working, and that can also lead to overproduction because the machines then can produce a lot of stuff. But who's going to be buying it if workers no longer have jobs? There is a lot of Nikes, but nobody has $500. And not only do you need to produce it, you need to sell it. So that is when, especially the small companies would be the first one to go bankrupt. Larger corporations have means to what economists call economies of scale. Right? If you produce a lot of something, you can cut costs easier. For a small mom and pop shop, it's much harder to do it, so they'll be the first one to go. And what happens to these people? They lose their livelihood, and they themselves either join this working force, but the working force is also largely unemployed. So capitalism will become more and more monopolistic, which in fact is happening, and that is something economists noticed. It's a more recent trend, especially in the United States. There's more and more monopolies. Some of them are hidden monopolies when the corporation owns several companies, and they have different brands, but it's all owned by the same parent company. Right? There are laws against it, and they try to resist it, but it is the trend. The capitalists whose companies have failed no longer capitalists. They are now proletarians themselves. They have no money, and they are lucky to get any kind of job. The larger number of unemployed workers will cause more competition for wages, giving greater power to the capitalists. If there is like so many unemployed people, capitalists can start saying, okay, we will only pay you $5 an hour. Do you want it? You have no choice, otherwise you have no money at all. So in the quest for more power, greater markets, and cheaper labor, companies will expand on an international scale. That's also inevitable. And that whole thing, according to Marx, is inevitable. Now, do you see signs of this scenario happening now? Like Marx didn't even think, I guess, about robots. They were, maybe some people could fantasize about it. Today it's a reality. They are making robots. There is actual problem now, which they're discussing, the possibility of all jobs going away, right? With AI especially. There will be no jobs. What are we going to do then? How are we going to live? Can you still have the capitalist system the way it's been for the past couple of 100 years?
I heard there were talks about implementing universal basic income.
That's one of the possible solutions. Obviously, there are people who are really against it. Again, guess who? Conservatives. They think people will get lazy. Well, it may indeed have some detrimental effect on some people. Because, I mean, again, remember Marx saying that it's not just the leisure which people want. People want jobs. They want to do something useful with their life. If the government just gives you money and says, you're not good for anything, just sit at home and watch TV, you may not feel very good about yourself too. I mean, it's a partial solution. It's better than nothing, because if it's nothing, then, I mean, that's totally insane. Nonetheless, that is indeed the pressure we have from the base, from these productive forces. With AI, with robotics developing, it is inevitable. It may not have been a problem 200 years ago. It is a problem now. And think about the future. They say that, 50% of all jobs will be gone in like 10 years. That's actual numbers they are saying now. How about 100 years from now? What's going to be happening then? Well, fortunately, we're not going to find out, but some people will. Some of the people who are born right now will still be alive 100 years from now. And good luck to them. I mean, never mind the environmental problems we have with all that. Yeah, so that is, of course, according to Marx, inevitable. And then the proletariat will be the antithesis to capitalism, because the proletariat will put this pressure. The size of the proletariat will be rising. There will be more and more of these destitute, poor people who have nothing to lose but the chains themselves. And while the wealthy are getting wealthier, the poor people will be getting more and more poor. There will be pressure on the society, inevitable pressure, which, again, we already can observe. It is exactly what's happening now. Billionaires are getting richer and richer, top 1% wealthier and wealthier, but the bottom people, and part of it is, again, the result of them moving the production away. That is definitely one of the things which started this process. Because when they started moving production overseas, who was losing their jobs? The poor people, the people who were working manual work. Management, especially higher level management, still have their jobs. They work in corporate offices. They get the profit from those overseas factories. Right? So that's why they have even more money now than before. They can now extract more from those Chinese workers who are working for $500 a month. Why would they even want to pay decent wages here if they can pay $500 a month there? But while they are doing better, everybody else is doing worse. The natural solution, again, would be something like the universal income, other types of welfare to help the people on the bottom, because they're getting more and more destitute. But as a result, we actually go in an opposite direction. Let's give a tax breaks to the rich. Somehow it will trickle down. How is it going to trickle down? How? No, through charity. Yeah, right. So that is what Marx was saying, and it definitely seemed to be happening. And he thinks in that case revolution is inevitable, because at some point all these people on the bottom who are destitute and have nothing else to lose will rise up. And of course, especially in this country when almost everybody has a gun, it's not that hard to imagine. And then what? Of course, typically the way revolutions happen is not when people themselves do it. It actually, if you look even at Russian Revolution, the most dangerous force for the government and for those in power is the army. The people who are already have guns and have the structure. And what frequently happens is because who is the army? Are they Martians? Are they people from another planet? No, they are part of society. They have brothers and sisters who are not in the army and who may be suffering. But they have guns and tanks and airplanes. And as long as there could be a point when, for example, government gives an order to an army, the way it happened in St. Petersburg, actually, in Russia. The Tsar gave an order to the army to shoot at the people because the people were demonstrating. They had no bread in St. Petersburg. And he wanted to suppress this. So he gave an order to shoot, and they refused to shoot. But what happens to a soldier when he refuses to shoot? Court-martial, right? So they immediately had nothing to lose. And what they did is they shot all the officers, because the officers were the ones who would court-martial them. It's a natural thing to do. You are my officer? Okay, boom, no longer officer. And they took control. And there was several 100,000 of these people in St. Petersburg who were armed and who also shot the police, and they took the entire city in control. And from then on, they were the force. They were the ones who demanded things to be the way they wanted it to be. So that's the biggest danger. And obviously, if things go the way they're going, it could get there. There are several different scenarios you can think about. Marx thought it was inevitable. Hopefully it's not inevitable. Hopefully there are ways to avoid this, because it's not fun, right? It's not fun for anybody. Again, looking at history of Russian Revolution, which I know pretty well, it was absolutely horrible. The people who were more idealistic and who believed it's going to lead to something better were among the first ones shot. Because the people who took control, usually they are not idealistic people. They are like hands in blood pragmatics. And those people do not tolerate any kind of dissent. So that's not an ideal situation. It's best to avoid it. Marx didn't think it was possible. He, however, thought that the good news is then socialism is inevitable. Socialism, according to Marx, he did not describe socialism and communism in detail. But socialism, according to him, is when workers take control of the means of production themselves. How it exactly can happen, that's again, like I said, difficult to imagine with the current system, because what happened in Russia, workers did have this control for maybe a couple of months, and then it was still lost, and the state controlled it. Can workers really control the means of production? Can there be a way to do it? Well, I guess it also partly depends on the means of production themselves. If you have factories, somebody still have to work there. But if you have factories with robots, you can imagine workers taking over control of that, right? They don't even have to work there anymore, but they can at least control the product which they produce. And then the next stage after socialism is communism. Communism, he's very brief about it. He's deliberately vague what it is. He says it's a dictatorship, result of the dictatorship of proletariat. The people will control not only political decisions, but also economic life of the country. No more private ownership of means of production, no tension and contradiction, mutual cooperation. It seems like he still allowed for private property for the individuals to have. Like some people think that under communism you have no private property whatsoever. Well, that would be rather absurd, right? Like you don't even have your own pants. You get up in the morning and somebody took your pants. That seems ridiculous. But not means of production. Nobody will own factories. Factories would be like belonging to all the people. And again, it seems like that system could be imagined if there are indeed so many robots, to put it bluntly, that would do all the unpleasant manual work and produce things in such huge numbers that there will simply be no need to worry about it for individuals, right? You could have a pair of pants, 2 pairs of pants. Nobody's going to have 1,000 pair of pants because you don't need that many. So that's what he means when he says everyone according to their needs, in a sense that it's ridiculous for people to need something which they don't even use. Why would you want to have a palace? Can you actually live in a palace by yourself? What would be the point of that? Like some of these billionaires have several homes, they don't even go there. The home stands there empty. What is the point? From the point of view of society, it's a huge waste, right? It just doesn't make any sense. You could house so many people, do so many good things with it if it was more equally divided amongst other people. Now, whether it's a good idea or bad, there are disagreements. But from the purely economic point of view, it does seem to make some sense. Because even though the argument is made, well, if nobody can accumulate this much wealth, people will not be working very hard. Well, they will be working hard. You still, for one thing, that's another interesting example. Like in this country, right, doctors and lawyers make the most money. And people say if they were not paid that much money, nobody want to be a doctor. I always think, though, about my experience, because when I grew up in the Soviet Union, doctors and lawyers were among the lowest paid. They were 100% paid by the government, and a typical medical doctor would be making less money than the factory worker. So you would say, why would anybody want to be a doctor? Well, people really wanted to be a doctor. Why do you think?
Ambition, honor, respect.
Exactly. Honor, respect. You're doing something which helps other people. You have so much respect for them. You feel better about yourself, what you do, right? Among the obvious things, you go into work wearing, white coat and not like covered in dirt like most workers. You're sitting in a nice, clean room, and you're helping people. Why wouldn't you want to do it? Yeah, you paid less money, but you still feel better about yourself, which is the most important thing. So yeah, there was a huge competition in medical colleges. It was one of the most desired occupations. Not so much for lawyers, but for different reasons. So yeah, the money are not needed to encourage that. In fact, people, again, mostly should not worry as much about money as about honor, respect, how much do you like what you do, and so on. There are problems with the system too, but that certainly does seem to work better in many ways, especially the healthcare and education. Those were indeed thriving because there were so many doctors. You wouldn't believe how it worked. You could call doctor at home anytime you get sick. When I was sick as a child, we would just call and free doctor would come to your home, take your temperature, and talk to you. Like, can you imagine it here? You'd have to be a billionaire at the very least. Not even a millionaire can afford it. How much would it cost to have a doctor come to you? You go to see a doctor for 5 minutes, pay $200. Never mind doctor coming to you at home. Actual medical doctor. So yeah, that obviously has its benefits. There are problems with it too. Nonetheless, Marx thought communism is inevitable. He thought that would be some of the quotes. It is the ascent of man from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom. So instead of us being slaving for the boss in his kingdom of necessity, we would be our own bosses in a kingdom of freedom. For each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. So that's kind of the main principle. You do what you can. You do the job you can do, but you get whatever you need. So first of all, of course, the basic needs such as housing, medical care, food. But again, it's not necessary, doesn't necessarily mean that you would get the bare minimum, like a room in a dorm or something. When society is at the higher level of development, when forces of production are developed enough so that there is plenty of products and they are easier, cheaper to produce, everybody could have at least decent home, right, and decent medical care and so on. So that is at least the goal. That's what he wanted to happen. Another quote, communism is the genuine resolution of the conflict between man and nature, between man and man. Communism is a riddle of history solved, and it knows itself to be the solution. Now this is where many people have a problem, because just like for Hegel, the question of whether we can ever resolve all the conflicts, well, it does seem like it is self-defeating, because if you ever resolve all the conflicts, what is there left? Remember, just like Nietzsche was saying, shouldn't some conflict be present? Shouldn't you have at least some conflict in your life, some degree of suffering? And this is where Nietzsche kind of disagrees with. By the way, Nietzsche never read Marx. Unfortunately, by the time he became insane, Marx was not that popular. He read some other socialists, such as Proudhon, which Marx, by the way, really criticized. And we don't know what Nietzsche would say about Marx, but his criticism of socialism in general is similar to that. And there are several other problems which typically are mentioned there, like the inevitable forces of history. I already mentioned it, right? He says it will happen inevitably. He says that what's on top, the superstructure, is simply derivative from the bottom. But here's the question we can immediately ask them. What is Marx himself then doing? If it's inevitable, do you even need to talk about it? Isn't your ideas kind of unnecessary? It will happen when it will happen. People in Russia, by the way, were also wondering whether if revolution was timely, given that Russia wasn't very capitalist at the time. It actually was mainly agrarian society. And many people are pointing to this and saying, according to Marx, we are not there yet. And Lenin and other Bolsheviks were saying, no, it will be fine. We can do it. We have some capitalism, a little bit. Well, and now, when it failed miserably, clearly, a lot of people are saying maybe those people who criticized it were right. It wasn't the time yet. So it's not that it cannot happen. It's just it has to be a right time. So that's the question. Anyway, that's enough about Marx. We will come back on Monday to the issue of economic fairness and economic justice and finish up the lecture part on that. I'll see you guys Monday.